Hello, and welcome to Horns of a Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review, TNSR. I'm Doyle Hodges, Executive Editor of TNSR. The Russian war in Ukraine is in its seventh week, and it's safe to say that it's not going the way that many analysts anticipated it might. Indeed, the last 10 days have been very eventful as we've seen Russian forces withdraw from the area around Kyiv, and as they've done so, atrocities that presumably were perpetrated by Russian forces in the city of Bucha have come to light, which appear, based on the evidence that's available to this point, as if they may constitute grave breaches of the Geneva Conventions. Here to join us in a discussion of this are several experts in the field, and I'll ask them to introduce themselves now. Michael, why don't we start with you?
I'm Michael Kofman. I direct the Russian Studies program at the Center for Naval Analyses, and I'm also a fellow at Center for New American Security.
I'm Mark Pomar. I'm a senior fellow at the Clements Center, and before that, I ran a foundation in Russia. I ran IREX with offices throughout Ukraine and Russia and parts of the world, as well as an old radio hand, having run Radio for Europe, Radio Liberty, and VOA back in the Cold War days.
Excellent. And Alexandra.
Hi, I'm Alexandra Sukalo. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the Clements Center for National Security at the University of Texas at Austin. I'm a historian of Russia and Eastern European history. And in a prior life, I was a Eurasian military analyst for the Department of Defense.
Excellent. So as you can see, we have an outstanding panel of experts assembled today. And I think perhaps the best way to set the context, especially since events on the ground are changing so rapidly, would be just with an update on where we are now. And Michael, could you give us a summary of how that's shaping up?
Yeah, sure. So we're now really past what you might consider to have been the first phase of the war. We're now well into the second chapter. In the opening of the war, Russia attempted a quick regime change operation where they thought Ukraine would surrender within a matter of days. That failed. They then tried to adjust and chase after a host of different objectives at the same time, pursuing a very diffuse military strategy, going for the Ukrainian capital, Kyiv, for Ukrainian forces in Donbass, for the southern coast, for the western part of Ukraine along the coast where Mykolaiv and Odessa are. And this was also unsuccessful. In the last couple of weeks, you've seen them basically withdraw and reframe the strategy, right? They've largely retreated from Kiev, where that operation was unsuccessful and was ultimately a defeat. Now they're attempting to regroup forces, reinforce units for a larger military operation in the Donbass. A substantial percentage of Ukrainian forces are there. They're in something called the Joint Forces Operation. And they've been facing off against Russian units since the beginning of this war. Russian military is also fighting for the coastal city of Mariupol along the Sea of Azov. And if they're able to take that city, then it'll free up manpower and logistics for a push into the Donbass from the south. The Russian military has suffered considerable attrition and losses, right? It's difficult to come by good numbers. And so take these, please, with a grain of salt. But if you assume that they started the operation with something along the lines of 130 battalion tactical groups, they might have something towards 80 or so effective right now, and a number of units that are in various states of low combat effectiveness or trying to be reorganized or regrouped. They're still moving units from Belarus all the way across towards Belgorod region so that they can reinforce this offensive into the Donbass.
Those of us who are not as familiar with the Russian military setup, roughly how large is a battalion tactical group?
So battalion tactical groups are on average around, you can say 750. To be honest, they range between 600 and 1,000 personnel. By definition, a task organizing grouping is task organized, but they tend to be standardized more towards the 700 to 800 mark. So the last part I want to say is that at this stage, the Russian military kind of has to fight what it has on hand because it has generated a lot of its immediate military capacity, and they've scraped a large part of the force for reinforcements. It's not a very large standing force. It was not designed originally or conceptually for sustained ground defensives across this amount of territory and along multiple axes or fronts, right? And so many of the challenges are coming to the fore, not just from the Russian performance in the war and how the military has fought, but also some of the more structural choices that they made in the military in the run-up to it. And it's clear that they weren't prepared and didn't intend to fight a long war. So now it may be that they're revising their war aims, at least for this coming next phase.
So two more sort of context questions. One is it strikes me that as the Russian focus shifts to the east, that the role of Belarus may decrease as the conflict progresses. Does that seem accurate? And the second is that oftentimes in conflicts, militaries suffer the largest number of casualties when they are withdrawing or retreating, because at that point their forces are already depleted, the morale has diminished, and it's also challenging to fight a retreat while engaged, while still protecting the things that you need to protect. I'm curious if we've seen any indication of increased Russian casualties in the withdrawal from the Kyiv region before they got back across the border into Russia.
Belarus has been a material party to the war. Obviously, the operations in the northern part of Ukraine all came from Belarus, and Russia's been used as the main staging and logistics area, also the area from which they've been flying air operations and conducting strikes. It's unclear if all of Russian units will leave Belarus or if they'll leave some of the disorganized formations there just sort of as a hanging threat to Kiev, so that Ukrainian forces can't completely free up to reinforce the units in the Donbass. The retreat is interesting. Obviously, this is a very incomplete picture, but from my point of view, it's probably one of the better operations they were able to organize to retrograde out and to cover their retreat. They took significant losses in ambushes in terms of some of the units that tried to get out, definitely got ambushed. And you see they have some losses. But on the other hand, if you remember the earlier part of this conflict, there's all this news about a 40-mile stuck Russian convoy on the way to Kiev running out of fuel, and it disappeared. So the long story short is, now that Ukrainians do have control basically all the way up to the border, you see that probably some of the information about the stuck Russian convoy wasn't true or wasn't exactly accurate. Because it dissipated, they were able to reorganize effectively, and they were able to withdraw most of their forces from the region.
Yeah, talking about that redeployment from the sort of central to the eastern region reminded me when the U.S. was part of the multinational force in Beirut and chose to strategically redeploy, was the term that the Reagan administration used at the time, to the ships offshore following the bombing of the Beirut barracks. There was a political cartoon about great strategic redeployments in history, which included Napoleon's strategic redeployment from Moscow and a couple other things like that. So just that challenge of trying to put a positive spin on something that is militarily a pretty tough black eye to swallow. And that actually is a segue. Alexandra, I wonder if you can talk to us about how is this conflict being received by the Russian people? What information are they getting? How are they perceiving it? Do they think this is a war that's going well, that's going poorly? What's it like?
Yeah, so it's complicated and society is divided. Since the first days of the war, there have been anti-war demonstrations and protests across Russia, of course, in the major cities, Petersburg and Moscow, but in regional centers really across the breadth of Russia. And thousands of protesters have been detained, with the majority being in major cities. And despite increased crackdown by police, these kind of protests show no signs of abating, I would argue. What's interesting is it's largely a grassroots movement, though notable Kremlin critics like Vladimir Kara-Murza and Alexei Navalny, who just had his prison sentence extended, are working to mobilize people in the ways that they can. At the same time, a lot of the organization is happening at the ground level. And people are also signaling their dissent by their feet. And according to an estimate from a Russian economist, there are now up to 200,000 Russians who fled Russia. So that's one segment of the population. At the same time, there are Russians who do support the so-called special military operation. And according to a March 31st poll by the Levada Center, which is one of the, one independent polling centers in Russia that I trust, the majority of respondents support the actions of the Russian armed forces in Ukraine. And so that kind of begs the question, where's the locus of the support? Why are they supporting it? And I would say there's two main reasons for this. The first is that since his ascent to power, Putin has been actively working to control the information space in Russia. And now Putin arguably has a total monopoly on this information to a large extent. He's been attacking independent media in Russia since 2003, when he shut down the only then independent television channel. And then since the war in Ukraine, we've seen the remaining independent media, for example, TV Dost and Echo Moskvy have also been shut down. And why this matters is because most Russians still get their news from TV. So as long as Putin continues to control that space, it's going to be harder for the vast majority of Russians to actually have a true insight into the war.
Yeah, I'm just curious because, I think of many Americans who are getting a majority of their information from online sources. And we're all familiar with the idea of the Great Firewall of China, but I've not heard of an analog in Russian media. Is there censorship and blocking of Western media sites in Russia, and how available is Western media information to a Russian citizen through the internet?
Yeah, I'll answer that and punt it to Mark as well. But I mean, my sense of it is that, it's difficult, but it's not impossible. With a good VPN and a little ingenuity, you can get most of the information you want. And also, lest we forget, a lot of Russians have contact with people outside of Russia, and they're also getting news from them. And so it's not the same, definitely not the same extent as China. Do you want to take that?
Yeah, I would agree with that, but I would say that Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty has taken on a major role in terms of getting information to the country. And the minute their site is blocked, they recreate another one, and they're doing all kinds of fancy technology to make sure that their programs are available on YouTube, which, as I understand, is still available in Russia. YouTube programming you can still get, because there's a lot of entertainment program that Russians are used to watching on YouTube. And so there's been a hesitancy on the part of the Putin government to shut down YouTube. And the radios in general, and the program Current Time in particular, which I watch every morning, I highly recommend it. It's probably the most thorough account that I have seen anywhere as to what's going on in Ukraine. And in Russia to some extent, which is interesting. But in Ukraine, they have over 200 freelancers feeding in stories from all over the country, interviews with mayors, people on the street, villages. They even had an interview today with a woman in a town occupied by Russians, but she was calling in and describing the situation. And in terms of Russia, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty has still maintained its freelance network in Russia, and they're still feeding. And I just saw the other day a set of interviews in Yekaterinburg, the city on the very edge of Siberia, where they came up to people and they asked them, showing them pictures of what is happening in Ukraine and saying, how do you react to that? Some people immediately turned away and said, no, that's all false, that's all false. Others watched and said, no, this is going to be a tragedy for Russia. And they're trying to engage people on the street in that way. Not in Moscow, not in St. Petersburg, but in the various different areas where they still have an exceptionally rich network of freelance contributors.
It's kind of fascinating to think that YouTube is a critical source of information. We can get cat videos, how to jump a car, and ground truth on what's going on in Ukraine. And that may actually be the order of preference and priority that those things get clicked and liked on. So I'm sorry, Alexandra, I didn't mean to cut you off, but it's just kind of curious about that. Please go on.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, I think the other big piece of support for those who are, seeing value in Russia's military operation in Ukraine is Putin has been promulgating a myth for a very long time now. He's laid this groundwork on this idea of the Ruski Mir, the Russian world. And it's this idea really that Ukrainians constitute part of the Russian nation. It's part of the founding myth of the Russian nation, that Russia as a nation was conceived and born in Kyiv. And a lot of people, especially with the support of the Russian Orthodox Church, which is completely backing this idea, there's appeal to it, right? And Putin has used it as part of his aim of establishing Russia as a civilization-forming state and a leading geopolitical actor. And I think that appeals to part of the Russian population that still very much sees it as playing a major part in the world and wanting to sort of assert itself on the global stage. And so this idea that Russian speakers across the world, and particularly in Ukraine, need protection, I think that resonates with a part of the population of Russia. So that's maybe why there's support for the war.
So, Mark, I'm curious, because one of the surprises for folks like myself who had only a cursory knowledge of the state of play in the information space going in has been the degree to which Ukraine, at least from the perspective of a Western observer, appears to have absolutely dominated the information space, whether that be the creation of sort of myths like the Soldiers of Snake Island or the Ghost of Kiev or these sorts of things, or the ability, Zelensky appearing at the Grammys, appearing in all these sorts of areas in order to get the message across. I'm curious from the perspective of someone who has worked in this space for decades, what your assessment of the information campaign is on both sides, and whether my sense that it's going well for Ukraine and surprisingly less well for Russia is accurate, or whether that's simply a slanted view from a Western observer.
Well, I think one has to step back and look at 2011, 2012, when I happened to be living in Russia and working at the time. And at that moment, Russia started taking a very, very anti-Western, anti-American policy that meant closing down all the NGOs, closing down American and Western organizations, cracking down on their media. It was a policy very much sustained to isolate organizations dealing with the West from the Russian population. I was heading one such organization that got closed down in 2015 and declared an undesirable foreign organization. Ukraine took absolutely the opposite direction. What we saw in Ukraine starting earlier, but certainly picking up steam in 2012, 2013, 2014, was a welcoming of as many organizations that were able to operate in Ukraine. My old organization, IREX, had its largest organization office in Kiev, working precisely, Doyle, on media, on access to media, on social media, on training of social media. Internews, another large NGO based in the United States, had a large operation on TV, on social media, ways to get out. You had a welcoming on the part of Ukraine of as many Western organizations as is possible. And I would say, in addition, the welcoming of the large Ukrainian diaspora that has played a great role in precisely opening these opportunities for Ukrainians and for Zelensky to adopt. This is a concerted effort that crosses, and the desire of so many Ukrainians to be part of Europe, of course, meant their facility with English, their comfort level with dealing with the West, and their welcoming of the West, which I think is so fundamentally important. Russia, meanwhile, was getting more and more and more isolated. And pretty much the last couple of years, we're back to the Cold War, we're back to Brezhnev, we're back to actually even beyond that, where there's so little contact, so few ties, and the ties that exist are suspect. And the people who want to engage with the West and Russia often find themselves in trouble with the police, with the various security organs. So I think that difference certainly is starkly there for us to see. I may add also that Ukraine has developed a very robust civil society, a society that has parties and meetings and elections and local, and despite obviously the corruption that exists on various high levels, there is a vibrant society of work in Ukraine, and that has helped them organize, and that has helped them reach out.
So I'm just curious because, I think that the United States has often been a standard bearer for freedom of the press. And yet, if you think about the effect of free press on our civil society over the last decade, it has not been to encourage the open and free exchange of information, but rather to polarize people in order to self-select news sources that are congenial to their pre-existing worldview. And I'm curious how Ukraine seems to have been able to avoid this trap, or is it simply that they're in the face of such an existential threat that they kind of all agree on this one and will go back to violently disagreeing with each other once they've defeated the external threat?
Well, an external threat has a way of uniting a country. And I think what Putin has done in many ways is united Ukrainian-speaking with Russian-speaking Ukrainians, has brought together parties that were otherwise at each other's throat, has brought together different parts of the country because you have an external threat. And I think that has definitely helped. And a desire, very broadly, from all of the polls we've seen and from all the casual and informal conversations I've had, the desire to be part of the West, part of Europe, and away from Russia.
Yeah, it has struck me that Putin has achieved more to unite Europe in a shorter time than any European politician had a hope of doing. And I suppose that betrays a view that, at least at the moment, Russia is not behaving as a member of Europe. But it is certainly remarkable the degree to which it has coalesced not only in the countries that have been attacked, but also the countries that fear themselves under the risk of attack. And something that has been impossible to achieve over the past 2 decades, when I think the only country that took more troops out of Germany than the United States was Germany. So it's been kind of fascinating to watch their commitment to renewed defense spending and things like that. So my next question actually kind of goes to Alexandra and to Michael, and it goes to this question of preparedness of the population to support the ongoing effort. I saw a recent announcement that that Russia is facing a renewed draft of approximately 135,000 soldiers to come in. And I'm curious how this is being perceived among the Russian population. Michael, I think I saw some stuff that you had put on Twitter suggesting that this was something that was relatively routine, that it is something that's done anyway. But I'm wondering how it's viewed in light of the ongoing military operations, and if we should anticipate that it will make the question of public support any more salient as this goes on. Whichever of you feels eager to take that on first, I'm happy to hear from you.
I'll say something and then I'll pass it to Michael. I mean, I think what's interesting, I agree. This is a part of the 2 drafts that occur per year. This is the spring draft that'll run from the 1st of April to the 15th of July. And where I think there could be political or public dissent, and it can be potentially explosive for Putin, is that conscripts now serve for a year, and they usually spend the first 2 months doing basic training, and then months 3 to 6 doing more advanced military training, where they learn their military occupational specialty, and then they got shipped out to their assigned units. Current Russian law prevents Russian conscripts from being put into a hot zone before they hit that 4 months of training. Now, Putin could, if he declares martial law, which is his right under the Constitution, or general mobilization, supersede the law that's on the books. But I think that if he does that, there's going to be massive, massive backlash. And there's already a lot of public pressure. There's as much public pressure as there can be right now in Russia. For example, the Committee of Soldiers' Mothers of Russia has been reporting since at least December of 2021 that conscripts were being immediately sent to the border of Ukraine, and then they've been helping since the war started families locate their soldiers who have ended up in Ukraine, even though they're not supposed to be there per the 4-month training. And so there is pushback on this.
The draft is biannual, right? And typically they pick up around 134,000, the latter in this case. In April, at the same time, the presidential order releases the current batch of conscripts who have served out their year. The challenge the Russian military has right now is it's largely out of manpower. It has a lot of equipment. It doesn't have the men. They basically expended the active battalions they have. They're trying to fight a war that they're calling a special operation without declaring a state of war. No state of war, no national mobilization, no ability to conduct stop loss, to hold conscripts over, or to mobilize the large amount of manpower reserves they have. This is a big issue. First issue is it's clear they've been lying, and a number of the units in the war have conscripts in them because conscripts serve in support roles. Even if you do have a BTG and it's contract staff, you still have conscripts backing it in support roles in the operation. Second, there's an established practice in Russia of intimidating conscripts halfway through their service and threaten them with terrible service conditions, or they sign a contract. Once they sign a contract, they're deployable, right? And that's how they sometimes double count and push conscripts into the contract ranks. Then they get into a BTG and they get sent to the war. Here's what I think the Russian military is trying to do right now. That military is structured on tiered readiness. So now it's largely exhausted in terms of what it has available in manpower. And behind the scenes, they're offering a lot of money for people to sign contracts so they can raise the manning levels without either holding conscripts beyond agreed terms of service or the president declaring national mobilization as part of a state of war. And so Ukrainians have, at least for now, and we can put aside the fact that they are, by all accounts, winning the conflict, but they have a window of opportunity at this moment. They know that the Russian military is trying to raise readiness. If they do, they'll have more battalions available to them within some period of time.
So I guess a couple of questions come to mind, and I throw them out to anyone who's eager to answer. One is that this question of avoiding the declaration of war due to domestic political consequences strikes me as something that resonates in what's generally considered a state with free and fair elections. But I'm curious how that works in a state like Russia, where elections are, often less than free than fair. I think that's a safe description. The second is this question of paying additional in order for conscripts to transition to contract troops, because with the onset of sanctions, it strikes me that hard currency and the ability to pay is going to be one of the things that is going to be in crisis if it isn't in crisis already. And how is it that Russia is going to be able to do this? Or is this going to be one of those things where someone is saying, gee, my recruiter lied to me afterwards? I'll open that up to anyone who's eager to comment on it.
Well, let me just jump in with a comment about the use of the word war. I mean, my sense is that it's for domestic political purposes, because there's such a long-standing Russian aversion to the word war, with all of its association with the World War II and so forth, that to say that we are at war is to create potentially panic and worry precisely among the people in Russia, rural communities and elsewhere, that basically are Putin's support. I think it would raise, whereas special operations, which is what they used in Georgia, I believe, as well, and in Syria. So it is one more event that Russia is doing, but it's not going to affect us, would be the thinking I would suspect of a person in one of the smaller towns or rural towns.
Michael?
Yeah, I just make a quick one thing on that. So I think the reason why Putin's really struggling with reframing this is, first, he'd have to admit that the special operation failed if he declared a war. Second, how can you declare a war against Ukrainians if your political thesis for what you're doing is to help liberate Ukrainians from these supposed nationalists? War aims he announced included denazification songs. So first, who's the war against, right? So now in some ways she's a little bit stuck. And yes, it's a personalist authoritarian regime. And yes, they have a lot of branding. And yes, he has options to reframe it. But just to be clear, the way he framed this conflict creates certain parameters, and there would be political costs and consequence for them to suddenly walk away from that and say, you know what, it's not a special operation. Turns out there's a state of war, we're at war, and then who are we at war with? Oh, it's the people I told you that we were actually trying to liberate and save.
Yeah, Alexandra.
Yeah, just to add to the point of conscripts and how conscription is viewed in Russia, I mean, it's deeply unpopular. The Russian government for a long time has been trying to move away to a largely professional contract force, and it just hasn't happened. So generally politically unpopular. Those with money get medical dispensation. There's a delay if you are in university, for example, you will still serve, but you have a delay. And so those who are wealthy enough or privileged enough are able to avoid it. And it's largely these rural populations of people who don't have those same opportunities afforded to them who end up serving. And I will say that there already has been evidence that along the border that soldiers are having to sign those contracts in order to extend them. And so that sort of pressure is already happening, at least according to those non-governmental organizations who are able to work. But interestingly, the FSB posed a new order in October of this past year that prohibits organizations from talking about military disposition and anything related, really publishing that about the military, which is just hindering the ability of these non-government organizations who sort of fight for human rights within the military. So it's just a mess.
So if I can shift gears just a little bit here, one of the most disturbing developments over the past week have been the images and the eyewitness testimony and the testimony of survivors coming out of Bucha. And certainly from the appearance of what we've seen so far, though I should add that the investigations have not even started, much less been completed, it would appear that these are grave breaches of the Geneva Conventions and of the additional protocols. Both Ukraine and Russia are states party to these agreements. And there's just there are no circumstances under the law of armed conflict under which shooting persons with their hands bound behind their back is not going to constitute a grave breach. I'm curious for Alexandra and Mark in particular, how this is being dealt with. Do Russian citizens know of what's happening there? Are they seeing the false flag narrative that we've seen played in other places? Are they believing it? And likewise, how is this being played in the international community? Because it strikes me that this is a delicate issue for Ukraine where they want to publicize it without being perceived as using it as an instrument in order to profit from the suffering of their citizens. So I'm very curious about the approach there.
Well, let me jump in with and note that there was a very important and I think article that a lot of people should read that was published in a Russian government-funded RIA Novosti site just a few days ago, because what it really spoke, and it had to pass military censorship, it had to be pretty much approved at a higher level. It talks about terror. It really is talking about inflicting terror and eliminating Ukraine as a nation. As a matter of fact, this whole notion of denazification is defined in that article as de-Ukrainianization. In other words, getting rid of this concept called Ukraine, which is fake according to Putin and his ideologues. It should not exist. And the language it uses, the way in which it expresses this terror against a people is not only frightening, it just takes you right back to Hitler's Germany, but it also would stimulate people to do precisely that, to start shooting, to start killing, because they are out to destroy some kind of people that should not exist. And I think the article also points to something that is worth discussing, and that is the idea behind it all, really a split Ukraine, where the center part of Ukraine and its eastern part are somehow attached to Russia, whereas the rump western part, which they call the Catholic Ukraine in the article, should be, they can be with Europe, they can be with the Poles, they're going to be small, insignificant, no access to the Black Sea, and therefore let them sort of stew in their own juices there. But we want the main part of it. The violence of the language, I think that is what struck me, and that echoes precisely what we're seeing not only in Bucha, but we're seeing it in all kinds of other places. And I think we'll see more and more of it as the weeks of the war come by.
Yeah, I mean, I think today the UN General Assembly, right, they suspended Russia from the UN Human Rights Council, and Russia's UN ambassador said, and I quote, that during the occupation of Bucha, not a single civilian suffered from any kind of violence. And, this kind of brings us to an interesting moment with commercial satellite imagery being available and everything else, the role that open source intelligence is playing in this conflict, because it's evident from these sources that the mass graves were already in existence while the Russians were still occupying Bucha, as were civilians lying on the street. So it's just the whole sort of argument against this is laughable. And I just want to touch on really, is this really surprising? Should we be surprised that this is the way that Russia's military is behaving? And I think, as Mark alluded to, in places like Mariupol, it's going to be horrific. If Bucha is bad, it's going to be way worse. And I would argue that, violence is both endemic and institutionalized within Russia's military. And a lot of people have heard of this idea of bedevshina, this hazing that occurs in the military, while the Russian Ministry of Defense says this isn't happening anymore. Russian NGOs have reported that the cases have actually risen in 2021. So, for a lot of these conscripts in particular, or soldiers, contract soldiers, they've experienced brutality and violence at the hand of their more senior officers or more senior soldiers. They then, are a product of this. There's been, death, suicide, disfigurement, PTSD, et cetera, coming out of this. And it just speaks to sort of the lack of morale and cohesion. I mean, if you don't trust the fellow soldiers you serve with, it kind of is a breakdown of command and a breakdown of order. And it really says something about the professionalization of the Russian military at this moment.
I'd like to just jump in and remind you that what happened in Chechnya, especially the second war in Chechnya, what happened in Syria with the bombing of hospitals, and there is a pattern of brutality. It's just that we are now seeing it on camera, on social media, on television, recorded in a way that in the past we did not. And I think, but the pattern was there, the behavior was there. This is just the full realization of it that we're seeing now.
Yeah, no, I think that's right, and it's deeply disturbing. But Michael, that leads me to an interesting question, because morale and military effectiveness are closely linked, as are morale and discipline. And the activities that seem to be characteristic of the Russian military are not normally taken as indicators of a military that is operating with discipline or morale. And I'm curious your assessment, based on how you've seen the campaign unfold thus far, where Russian morale and discipline are.
Well, all right. First, it was problematic from the very start because it's very clear that the campaign, as organized, was meant to be a covert operation. So they lied to the troops and then psychologically prepared them to go to war. They pushed them to the border. They told them they were going on exercises. That's one of the reasons things are so shambolic and very little has been prepared. And then they pushed them across the border to Ukraine under false pretenses, too. They told them that they were there to help Ukrainians liberate themselves and not to expect a very serious fight. And that's the first major impact on morale, right? The second one is the campaign's terribly organized. They're not well supported. You know what happens to troops when they run out of food and fuel? Watch morale plummet then. Russia has an officer corps and has warrant officers. It doesn't really have a leadership NCO corps like our military, maybe the British military does. And so there have often been issues of discipline in that military. Alexandra already touched on some of them, and I won't recap that discussion. I think clearly there's sustained issues with professionalization in that military, even amongst what we call contract servicemen. And I often used to harp on this because people used to associate contract with professional and conscript with not. And I said, that's completely untrue. Terms of service in your military has very little to do with professionalism and the ethos and the discipline in the unit. They actually don't. They're reasonably well-disciplined conscript armies or mix or hybrid of the two. And there are armies where you can have lots of contract servicemen like Russia's where you can clearly see the situation with discipline. When they're not well-led, when morale isn't there and they're not well-supported, it leads to marauding, it leads to extrajudicial killings and the like. The only note I will make, in addition to what my colleague said, is that some of these killings are very much intentional planned. They were part of a brutish so-called denazification campaign. Some of them are done by Chechens, by Kadyr's people, who are technically part of Rosguardia, and probably by FSB units. They went into Ukraine with kill lists. They clearly had a plan for territory they were going to occupy and people that they were going to eliminate, right? So some of this doesn't just look like Russian soldiers running wild or executing people. Some of this is done with intent. I just want to clarify that point. They had a vision for things they would do in Ukraine if they were able to overthrow the regime and take over the country. And that was, I think, to some of us, that was kind of evident from the start. It's just shocking to actually see it in the parts of Ukraine that they've occupied.
Yeah, it sort of makes me wonder, there's been a great deal of research done in the United States about the effect of moral injury on service members. And certainly if you take a look at the decline and fall of the Soviet Union, it seems that the role of service members coming back from Afghanistan had a substantial effect within the population in terms of shaking faith in the Soviet system, as when coupled with Chernobyl and things like that. And I can't help but wonder whether and how the experience of those who are serving in Ukraine now and being asked to do things that are going to leave scars on them for the rest of their lives is going to affect Russia as it goes forward. But speaking of Russia as it goes forward, we this conversation has flown by and we are coming up on the end of our time. And I would like to ask each of our panelists to take a couple of minutes and offer their assessment of what comes next. And Mark, perhaps we could start with you and then move to Michael and then conclude with Alexandra.
Well, unfortunately, I think the conflict the war is going to go on for a considerable amount of time. I don't see there's any way in which the Ukrainians could agree to the ultimatums that Putin has put forward. And I can't see Putin just withdrawing because I think that would lead to the end of his regime. So I think we're going to have to see a conflict that will go on some level. There is a hopeful scenario that it will be less and maybe focus more maybe on the eastern part, not because you want it there, but just because it would at least allow the rest of the country to somehow come back to normal life. But I see it as a conflict that's going to go on and one that doesn't have an easy resolution of any sort. I think the negotiations that have been taking part are basically just treading water and giving time to regroup or reassess what needs to be done. What worries me the most, though, and I guess I'll come back to that, is this brutality and destruction that we have seen. And that is something that would have horrendous consequences for Ukraine. But I think you're right psychologically for Russia down the road as well.
Michael?
Well, I'll focus on the military side of the equation. I think in this phase, we're looking at a set-piece battle for the Donbass and Russian focus on this area. They're going to try to take it and then I think declare victory. That won't necessarily mean an end to the war, but it'll certainly be a close to the second chapter. And then depending on how that fight goes, it'll dictate what material constraints they have to further prosecute the war. If they lose too many forces in this fight, or if they're unsuccessful, then that might be it for them for some months. It could then settle into a conflict of attrition or a war like we've seen between Russia and Ukraine post 2015. Russian military capacity for offensives will actually be pretty circumscribed. One of the big things that we don't know is, what does Putin understand about this war? To what extent he still thinks he has a good chance to impose his will on Ukraine? He probably does, maybe not within a matter of weeks, but over time. I think a lot of folks think that he's hunting for a victory by May 9th, the annual World War II victory parade, a great patriotic war victory parade that Russia likes to host. That might be the next potential political timetable. But I suspect this war will go on, and it's going to get uglier. And the two things I always say as big caveats as an analyst: first, wars don't necessarily end the way they begin. So I'm cautiously optimistic about Ukrainian military performance, how well they've done, and how this war started. But as always, I do urge that caution. Second, we don't know if we're at the beginning, the middle, or the end of the war, right? And for a lot of folks, the war's been going on 5 weeks, and they already want to know when's it going to end. And I have to sound the pessimistic note that this war's barely been going for 5 into 6 weeks now. And this is a major war in Europe. And the last point I'll say is that it's clear that Russia can sustain this conflict for some time, and Ukraine certainly will. It has the resolve, it has the resource, and it has Western backing. So it could become an even uglier war of attrition over time.
So I just want to follow up on one thing real quick, and you may have just addressed it with the sense that Russia can sustain it for some time, but certainly one of the areas in which the Russian army has been perceived to have a substantial qualitative advantage has been in their artillery, both in terms of shells, but also especially in multiple launch rocket systems. The latest figures I saw indicated they launched about 1,425 missiles so far during the campaign. And I'm curious if you have any sense of their inventories of these sorts of weapons and whether this is something that is still going to be available to them as they shift their operations to the east, or if we should expect to see some different tactics.
Now, those are long-range standout precision guided weapons. That's not the bulk of Russia's arsenal. Russia's a fires military. That's thousands upon thousands of fires. It's actually going to be a real question of what happens in the ammunition grind over time, right? If it becomes a war of attrition, then who has more ammunition for artillery? Ukraine heavily uses fires. On Twitter, it looks like a war of just ATGMs fighting in cities, but Ukraine's biggest success has been effective employment of fires. That requires ammunition, right? Well, I have to say, sorry, Twitter isn't real, and a lot of things you see on TikTok give you a very stylized perspective of the war. Doyle, you're making that face.
You've just shaken my faith in everything by saying that Twitter isn't real. That's now what am I going to do?
Well, the only thing I'll say is that as the war is framed now, Russia definitely can't sustain it in this way, not with these losses and not with this level of forces. If it settles into more of a conflict of attrition with largely, artillery skirmishes and the like, and some consolidated or hardened battle lines, that might be something the Russian military can continue. And a lot of that depends on your expectations kind of for the Russian economy, the impact of sanctions, which is a whole separate conversation.
Yeah, and that I think was really getting at the heart of the concern behind my question is, if they have to shift from these standoff precision-guided weapons to closer range fires, that we may see, in fact, if it's possible, less discriminate use of force on the part of the Russians. Alexandra, can you wrap us up with your sense of what's ahead, both for the conflict and for its effect on the Russian people?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm watching 3 things, 2 in the near term and 1 in the long term. As Michael said, May 9th, I really think that, Putin's going to want some sort of victory that he can bring home to the Russian people. I could see him going full circle with, the victory of the Great Patriotic War of the Soviet people over Nazi Germany. This is the, first phase of the Russian victory over the Nazi Ukrainian people. I could see him sort of framing it that way, what that looks like. I don't know, but look to the Donbass and other areas of Eastern Ukraine potentially for something he can claim as a victory. I'm also, I don't want to discount the Russian people, and I'm really interested to see the power and influence of women on the ground in Russia. And I say that because if we look at the history of Russia, women have largely led a lot of the revolutions in domestic, in the February 1917 revolution. The start of that, maybe a revolution of workers. I would argue that it's women on the ground who really start to gather and to put pressure and the workers join them. If we look at collectivization, women across Russia were largely protesting collectivization and achieving small victories. Have enormous losses. Same thing with Chechnya. I referenced before the Committee for Soldiers' Mothers, the pressure that they're putting. I think as we see this war continue in body bags come home. The mothers and the sisters of those Russian soldiers that have gone to fight and have lost their lives through this conflict, there's going to be more domestic pressure on Putin. So I think that's a space to watch. And then finally, as far as long-term goes, if we talk about, we didn't really talk about it today, but I mean, there's been a lot of talk about economic sanctions and the impact on Russia. And I would say the long-term effects of the brain drain. I referenced earlier that an estimation in the first 2 weeks of March was that 200,000 Russians left Russia. This is largely the highly skilled, educated, middle-class Russians that are leaving. For example, there's a report that says 70,000 computer scientists left Russia during this time period. And Putin is clearly nervous about this because he just announced legislation that would eliminate income taxes for people who work in information technology between now and 2024. And so what does that do in the long run for Russia if they don't have the people that can, do the technology that they need to survive as this global power?
Thank you very much. We've been talking with Michael Kofman at the Center for Naval Analyses, with Mark Pomar and Alexandra Sukalo of the Clements Center for National Security at the University of Texas, Austin. You can hear Michael's analysis of the campaign ongoing on our sister podcast, War on the Rocks. And thank you guys very much for joining us. Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma, and please don't forget to visit our website at tnsr.org.